Hi, I'm Nick Antes. Today I'll be talking about the Cayman Islands. So you can see on this picture, follow my cursor, this would be the Grand Cayman. And then there's the Little Cayman and the Cayman Rock. So there's three islands. And you see they're fairly small. I mean, if you look at this, 6 miles in length. So, I mean, it's no more than 20 to 25 miles in length on the largest island. So pretty small islands, you can see. In regards to the Cayman Islands, they're going to be talking about the history, dating back to their indigenous people, um, all the way to the present day, and then politics. We're going to be talking about more and so towards once it becomes under British rule, and then the current political sphere. Economics, we're going to look at some metrics to show, indicate how the economic system is built, um, show its strengths and weaknesses, um, show the sectors that are large in present day. In health, we're going to look at just the overall well-being of the nation, as well as its response to COVID-19 pandemic. And then for Stuart Hall and Michael Ralph Trio, we're going to use their texts to frame everything um, towards the narratives of the indigenous people um, and the silence voices. So, as I just mentioned, the indigenous people, you can see here, that would be the Iraq Taino, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, um, tribe. Um, and the Iraq refers to the population of the Caribbean, of course. Um, and so they were the population on the Cayman Islands, the indigenous population. And the word Cayman refers to their word of crocodile. And so on the island, the population was very small, especially in the early years. I found it very difficult to find information on the indigenous people. Um, and that obviously ties back into the misrepresentation. We're going to discuss that further. Um, and I think it's just important to be said here that you need to frame the people of the Cayman Islands before colonization, before there's documentation, before, so to speak, it's discovered as um, we've learned in history classes and as a lot of people think of it as. So it's important to say, well, no, it was not discovered, and then the indigenous people and population was here before. Moving forward, the first documentation was in 1503 by Christopher Columbus. He first saw the islands, and it became a Spanish possession. So this is when written history begins. And so for nearly a century, the island is used as a stopping point for travelers. They would stop, rest up. There was a large sea turtle population, so they would uh, eat the sea turtles, rest up, and then continue on their travels. In 1586, Sir Francis Drake lands on Grand Cayman, um, and he finds that it's inhabited. But they were only there for 3 days or 2 days, I believe. And so I find it interesting because when I read about it, they said they found it inhabited, but I think essentially the population was so small of indigenous people as it is a small island. And I mean, if you're only there for 2 days, you might not have an interaction with them. So it most likely was not. I mean, it wasn't inhabited. And then for centuries to come, just more and more people use it as a resting stop. And then in 1670, the Treaty of Madrid results in the islands being ceded to England. And this was a long-standing. I mean, it was a Spanish possession, and then for years and years, more and more, English people and European, Northern European or not Spanish people were using the island more and more. So then it's ceded to England, and it was governed under the same colony as Jamaica. So government is first put in place in 1750 using magistrates, essentially British officials sent over to enforce laws, to govern. Um, and towards the late 18th century, more and more settlers, and I put that in parentheses, begin to come. And I put it in parentheses because, they weren't settlers. They didn't settle on anything. They more conquered. They more came in and and eradicated land that wasn't theirs. They're not settling; they're taking. Um, so it is also important to say the population at this time, 1802, was very small. There's only 933 people, 545 of which were slaves. And I put this statistic down here, um, that in terms of slave to free inhabitant, it was like a 1-to-1 ratio. Over it wasn't at this time, obviously that math wouldn't add up, but in overall, like I think it was actually later in like 1860 or 1830s at the end, right before it was abolished, and that was much lower than others. Like Jamaica was a 10-to-1 ratio, but that doesn't take away from the fact that slavery still persisted and that slavery was occurring and that the exploitation of the indigenous people was happening. So I just wanted to mention that. And then in 1834, slavery becomes illegal throughout the British Empire. And there was actually a interesting thing I read about this. So essentially, after slavery was abolished in the British Empire, there's a 6-month apprentice period that basically enforced slavery for, 6 years, not 6 months. That essentially enforced slavery, just saying they're apprentices to kind of facilitate the economic rebuild because slavery was such a dependent um, component of their economic makeup. Um, so essentially, slavery wasn't outlawed in its full way, but in the Cayman Islands, they were not. There was no documented slaves. So after 10 months, they essentially became fully free. So I thought that was interesting. And in 1863, um, all the Jamaican laws are applied to the islands. So now they're really enforcing the laws together with the Jamaican Empire. Jamaica. And then throughout 19th century, the islands become more and more isolated, and the political sphere continues to run through British enforcement. Different people getting sent over to control the islands as well as Jamaica. In the 20th century, 800 Caymanians served in the Royal Navy during World War II. I just thought that was an interesting fact. In 1959, they received their first constitution. That's the first of 4. And in that constitution, it gave the right for women to vote. And then in 1962, Jamaica becomes an independent nation. So then the Cayman Islands have to decide either if they're going to become a sovereign free state, if they are going to stay under the British Empire, or if there's any other solution they can do. And then by unanimous vote, they end up staying as an overseas British territory. And so in then 72, a new constitution is introduced with a legislative assembly, executive council, and governor. And current politics. So in 1994, the Cuban crisis breaks out, also known as the Cuban raft crisis. So essentially, it was around 35,000 Cubans. Political unrest, Fidel Castro, there's rioting in the streets, and Cubans are trying to escape Cuba, get on rafts, and go to the U.S. And I believe it was the Clinton administration basically said, if we detain you, we're sending you to Guantanamo Bay. And so about 1,000 Cubans end up at what is known to be Tent City in the Cayman Islands. So they basically are harboring, well, not harboring, taking in refugees. And I say refugees because they were escaping political unrest. So take in refugees, 1,000, and then they've helped facilitate the refugee crisis by granting some asylum, helping them get into the U.S., and then a lot of others went to other Latin American countries. And so the new political system was defined as a parliamentary democracy, in which the executive power was within the governor and the cabinet. The legislative power was parliament, and the judiciary powers were broken up into three courts. And then finally, in 2009, the fourth written constitution came into effect. Um, so basically, it's been that same constitution since 2009, and the current political sphere is healthy and stable with good power balance. So looking at the economics, pre 1970, you could say it's defined by slave labor. I'm pre 1970. Obviously, this is dating all the way back to before the abolishment of slavery, but the beginning of their economic makeup is slave labor. So you can't forget the voices of the narratives of what happened, because a lot of their industries were built off slavery. Um, the economy relied on slavery. Um, and at the time, one of the main industries was turtles, as I mentioned before, that sea travelers would come and eat the turtle meat. And actually, the turtle industry almost died because basically they were overworking the slaves and over killing the resources. And this happened in other industries, such as mahogany, where they basically exploited all the resources on the island, and they began to dry up. And there was other resources as well than other than mahogany. Pardon me. And trade was mainly done with Jamaica, but again, I should have used trade in parentheses here because it's a form of trade that is built off exploitation and slave labor, so it's not true trade because there's a clear loser in the situation. And then economics post 1970. And 1970 I used as a kind of a stepping stone because that's when tourism really began to thrive in the nation, where they opened their borders more to tourism, and that's one of their largest industries, as well as the financial services and real estate. Um, and as in terms of financial services, one of the world's largest offshore banking systems. So essentially, people invest their money or bring their money into the Cayman Islands to avoid taxes and other things. So um, it's very interesting in that regard. And then there's no proper taxes, no controls on foreign ownership of property and land. And then right here, I just put some economic indicators. So I thought these were important, specifically when we're talking about foreign portfolio investment. As you can see, it's over 4 trillion, and so that would be people bringing their money into offshore bank accounts to avoid other discrepancies and whatnot. Um, so also the GDP and the inflation, the GDP growth rate of 4.1 and inflation of 2.8, and that is steady with all advanced economies around the world. If you look at the GDP growth rate of other advanced economies like the US or other European nations, you're looking at 3 to 4% with, and then also inflation of 2 to 3%. So basically their economic buildup is advanced and on the playing field of the big contender nations in the economic realm. For health metrics, the healthcare system is very strong. They provide services through different areas. People live long. The life expectancy is 82. There are 2 private hospitals on the island, and there's, I think, I forget the specific number of public hospitals, but there's a lot of the Ministry of Health has done a good job over the past couple of years. And then I show this graph because this is a histogram of the age population from 1990 and then 2015 on the right. As you can see, it goes from skewing towards a lower region towards older. So that means that the population is getting older, which means people in the nation are living longer. They're healthier. If you tend to look at, excuse me, if you tend to look at other very advanced nations, uh, such as Japan has, I think, one of the highest. It's a very skewed towards the top. That means less people are getting born in the nation, and people are living longer. Just an interesting thing to look at. And then responding to the pandemic, they've had 482 cases and only 2 deaths. Obviously, it's a small population. Um, Currently, it's about 65,000. So pretty small population, but 43,000 doses of the vaccine have been given on the island as of March 24th. Um, and during the pandemic, obviously tourism was stunted. Um, Limited people, could travel into the nation because of, I mean, X, Y, and Z, um, sanctions and whatnot. Requirements of testing and PPE, and I mean, obviously the COVID pandemic. Everyone's fully aware, well aware of what's been going on. And a stimulus package was introduced to credit residents, help build up small businesses, obviously provide PPE, make sure their medical programs are are up to par, staying with um, the pandemic, and then pumping money into struggling sectors like tourism, um, for instance. So for Silencing the Past by Trio, I mentioned, and he discusses the uneven distribution of power and knowledge. So he discusses how people learn often one perspective and take that as truth. As we've discussed in class before, the idea that Columbus discovered, and I feel like I use parentheses throughout this presentation to say like trade, or settled, because that's what these sources say. But the idea of what happened versus what is said to have happened, where it is said that, oh, they traded, but what happened was they traded off the backs of slaves. So um, it needs to be framed towards the Caribbean narratives, towards the narratives of the indigenous people that were enslaved. Um, and so the indigenous people, their story is overcasted because you're part of a European empire, and I think it's even more overcasted for the Cayman Islands in a way because they are still a territory of the British Empire. That for instance, Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, um, it kind of brings light to what was happening and what happened, and you can reflect on that much more clearly. And in this regard, I feel as if you can't, because they're still silenced because they're under the British occupation rule. Um, so the voices of Caribbean, of the indigenous population in the Caymans was very silenced. Excuse me. And then Cultural Identity and Diaspora by Stuart Hall. The idea of being, becoming, and that cultural identity is not linear. Um, and I used a subquote here of defines the history of the people. It recognizes the heterogeneity and diversity of the Caribbean, and that's diaspora. The idea of diaspora being central to the cultural identity. Um, it's contingent upon colonialism, diaspora, um, being central to Caribbean people, their identity. It's contingent upon colonialism, right? It's built upon the idea that they were massacred, shipped around, enslaved, destroyed. It's built on, their identity is built on, and you can't just forget that diaspora is such a huge component of their identity. And it helps explain, his readings help explain the trauma that was colonialism, and the repressed and silenced voices of the indigenous people. So why I chose the Cayman Islands. You can see here, I had thought I was a little older and then I traveled to the Cayman Islands. Turns out I'm this little one, youngest of three. I think I'm about one in that photo. So I have traveled to the Cayman Islands. Obviously, don't remember it at all. Um, but why I chose the Cayman Islands? Again, I thought I'd traveled when I was older, but so being an econ major, I also chose to look into the economic realm because um, obviously, again, being an econ major, but also I didn't know much about offshore banking. I still honestly feel like I don't understand it fully, but I thought because the Cayman Islands is one of the world's largest offshore banking centers, that it would be interesting to look into that and figure out how important it is towards their economy, their build up, um, and just overall like wanted to learn more about offshore banking. And then I also chose the health sector. I just think, I mean, obviously, this year everyone's well aware COVID-19. So I just thought, with the times and important, something cool to look at, something interesting. Um, but other than that, I mean, I just kind of chose the Cayman Islands because I had traveled there, and I mean, it definitely looks like a beautiful place to visit and see. And then, how will the readings help outside the classroom? Um, so, in a much broader speaking, I think just taking the text and kind of broadening them out to my daily life, trying to understand other people's viewpoints better, trying to trying to not take um, one view as truth, trying to listen to other people and interpret analysis and take other viewpoints and create my own understanding of things rather than reading the history book that says X, Y, and Z, or reading something that's telling me, rather than watching Fox News and taking it as truth, or watching CNN and taking it as truth. You really need to get the two sides of the story. You need to delve deeper. And I think because I mean, prior to this classroom, I had always thought of Christopher Columbus as discovering. Um, I had always thought of him, discovering these lands rather than, well, he didn't discover. So that's more of a broadly speaking area. And then for Glisson and Hall, Stuart Hall, um, I feel like I can apply it to my own life, that my identity, and then other people around me as well, that, it's not linear or fixed. And the idea of rhizomes, not roots, the interconnectedness around my world, that things build off of each other. They're not roots, they're not dead. And to one point, they're rhizomes, they build off each other. So my identity can build off other people. It can go off in every other direction. Um, and yeah, I just feel like I can apply a lot of the text just to my daily life in those ways. Um, I think that's all I have for you. Uh, Thank you.